Ready for a sleepless night? Tonight we're diving into 3 stories that will chill you to your core, so brace yourself. If you enjoy being scared senseless, hit that like button and subscribe, but don't say I didn't warn you. And while you're here, drop a comment on which tale creeps you out the most. Now, let's not waste any time. We're going straight into the darkness. The pressure. I never thought a road trip could turn into a nightmare. Driving across the open plains of Texas, you expect flat horizons, empty highways, and the occasional stop for gas. What I didn't expect was to find myself running for my life, trying to escape something I couldn't even see, something that was inside me. My name is Derek Monroe, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been driving these routes for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. Accidents, bizarre weather, even the occasional UFO nut parked on the side of the highway. But nothing like this. It all started a few weeks ago on a run from Amarillo to Lubbock. It was a quiet morning, the kind of day where the sky is an endless blue, and the road stretches out in front of you like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the plains. I'd just finished refueling at a small gas station on the outskirts of Amarillo, and was getting ready to hit the road again when I saw him. The man came out of nowhere, stumbling across the parking lot toward my truck. He was holding his head in his hands, his face twisted in pain, like he was trying to keep his skull from splitting open. "Help me!" he gasped, collapsing against the side of my truck. I jumped out of the cab, rushing over to him. "Hey man, you okay? What's going on?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "It's in my head. The pressure. It's too much. You gotta help me. I can't stop. I can't stop moving." Before I could ask him what he meant, he bolted, just took off running toward the highway. I called after him, but he didn't stop. He was running like his life depended on it, clutching his head, weaving between the cars on the road. I stood there stunned, watching as he sprinted across the highway. That's when I saw the truck. It came barreling down the road, and in one terrible instant, the man was gone, struck by the 18-wheeler. The impact sent him flying, his body crumpling onto the pavement. I ran over, but it was too late. He was gone. The cops showed up a little while later, and I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. They took my statement, asked a few questions, but it was clear they didn't have any more answers than I did. Just another tragic accident, they said. But something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. The way he'd been holding his head, the way he'd said he couldn't stop moving. There was something more going on. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something that made no sense. Then, a couple of days later, I started feeling it. It began as a dull pressure, like a headache that wouldn't go away. At first, I thought it was just stress from the road. Too many hours behind the wheel, too many sleepless nights in cheap motels. But the pressure kept building, a relentless pounding in my skull that got worse with every passing hour. By the time I was halfway through my next run, the pain was unbearable. It felt like my head was going to explode, like something was pressing in on me from the inside, crushing my brain. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. All I could do was drive. Then I heard the voice. At first, it was just a whisper buried beneath the hum of the engine, barely audible over the roar of the tires on the pavement. But as the pressure in my head grew, so did the voice. Louder, clearer, until it was all I could hear. "Keep moving." It repeated over and over again, drilling into my brain like a command I couldn't ignore. "Keep moving." I tried to stop. I pulled over on the side of the road, hoping the pressure would ease if I just rested for a bit. But the moment the truck came to a stop, the pain spiked. It was like a knife twisting in my skull, forcing me back behind the wheel. I had to keep going. If I didn't, I knew my head would burst apart, just like that man back in Amarillo. I floored the gas, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The pressure eased, but only slightly, like I was buying myself time. I drove for hours, through empty highways, past tiny towns, through the unrelenting flatness of Texas, my head pounding with every mile. But the voice never stopped. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving, had to outrun whatever was inside me. I turned off the main highway, taking back roads and side streets, trying to get as far away from everything as I could. But no matter how fast I drove, the pressure stayed with me. At some point, I found myself on a narrow 2-lane road, the kind that stretches on forever without a soul in sight. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the pressure in my head was growing worse. I could barely keep my eyes open, my vision blurring from the pain. That's when I saw the sign, 12 miles to Amarillo. I don't know why, but something about that felt wrong, like I'd been driving in circles, like I was being pulled back to the place where it had all started. The voice in my head grew louder, more insistent. Keep moving, don't stop. But I couldn't do it anymore. I had to stop. I had to figure out what was happening to me before it was too late. I pulled off onto a dirt road, the truck bouncing as it rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The moment the wheels stopped turning, the pain slammed into me again, sharper, more intense than before. I screamed, clutching my head, the world spinning around me. And then I heard it, a high-pitched whine like feedback from a radio, coming from somewhere in the distance. I stumbled out of the truck, my knees buckling under the weight of the pain, and looked around. That's when I saw it. Off in the distance, standing alone in the middle of the plains, was a tall metal tower, a radio tower humming with power. I don't know how I knew, but something told me that tower was the source of everything. The pressure, the voice, the pain, it was all coming from there. I staggered toward the tower, every step sending fresh waves of agony through my skull. The closer I got, the louder the whining noise became until it was almost deafening, like my brain was being shredded from the inside. When I finally reached the base of the tower, I collapsed onto the ground, my hands shaking as I looked up at the metal structure. The voice in my head was screaming now, a constant barrage of words I couldn't understand. I didn't know what to do, I just knew I had to stop it. With the last bit of strength I had left, I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the control box at the base of the tower. The rock hit with a loud crack, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. And just like that, the pressure stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, gasping for breath, my head finally free of the crushing pain. The silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating, but it was a relief. The voice was gone. I don't know who built that tower or what it was for, but I know one thing. It wasn't just broadcasting radio waves. It was doing something else, something that got inside people's heads and twisted them, made them do things they couldn't control. I destroyed the control box, but I don't know if that's the end of it. There could be more towers out there, more people like me, trapped in their own bodies, forced to keep moving. I never went back to Amarillo, I couldn't. Too many unanswered questions, too many things I didn't want to think about. Now every time I'm on the road, I keep my eyes on the horizon, watching for anything out of place. Anything that might be pulling me back into the nightmare. And every time I hear the faint crackle of static on the radio, I turn it off. Just in case. The lights beneath. I've always considered myself a city guy. The forests, the wilderness, they never appealed to me. But I guess life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you don't want to be. My name is Daniel Scott, and I'm a detective with the Boulder Police Department. I've worked cases involving missing hikers before, people getting lost in the thick woods of the Rockies, some of them turning up days later, disoriented but alive. Others, not so lucky. But the case I took last month still keeps me up at night. It wasn't just about missing people. It was about something else. Something that shouldn't exist. It started with a call about a group of environmentalists who had gone missing deep in the Roosevelt National Forest, just outside Boulder. They'd been protesting a logging operation out there, camping in the woods to stop the logging company from moving forward. They had been there for a few weeks, making plenty of noise, but when the crew showed up to work that Monday, the protesters were gone. Their tents were still set up, their supplies untouched, but there wasn't a single person left at the camp. The whole group, 5 people, had vanished overnight. I was called in to investigate, and at first I figured it was just a case of some activists getting spooked and leaving in a hurry. Maybe they'd heard animals, or the weather had turned bad. But when I got out to the site, it was immediately clear that something much stranger had happened. The camp was located in a dense part of the forest, the kind of place where the trees block out most of the sunlight, leaving everything in a permanent state of twilight. When I arrived, the logging crew was standing around the perimeter, clearly uneasy. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have, and there was a sharp, almost metallic smell that I couldn't quite place. The tents were still standing, their flaps fluttering slightly in the breeze, but inside, everything was perfectly intact. Sleeping bags, clothes, food, all of it untouched. It was like the protesters had just stepped out for a moment and never came back. But what really caught my attention were the trees. Several of the trees surrounding the camp had strange markings on them, long, deep scratches that ran up the trunks, almost as if something had clawed at them. The marks were too high to be from any animal I'd ever heard of, and too precise to be caused by the wind or weather. What the hell happened here? I muttered to myself, running a hand over the rough bark of one of the trees. That's when I heard it. A low humming sound, barely audible, but definitely there. It seemed to be coming from beneath my feet, vibrating through the ground. I knelt down, pressing my hand to the dirt, and felt the faintest tremor, like something was moving deep underground. I wasn't alone. One of the protesters had a brother in town, Dylan Ramirez, and he insisted on coming out with me to search. He was convinced his sister, Isabella, wouldn't just disappear without a trace. We decided to stay overnight at the camp, hoping to pick up any sign of where the group had gone. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply, and the darkness around us seemed to thicken. The forest was unnervingly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. Dylan sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "I don't get it," he said quietly. "They wouldn't have just left like this, not without calling." "I don't think they left," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Not by choice, anyway." He looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "You think something happened to them?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I've got a bad feeling about this place." Around midnight, the humming returned. It started faint like before, but this time it grew louder, pulsing through the ground in waves. Dylan stood up, looking around in confusion. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my hand instinctively going to my flashlight. "Stay close." The fire flickered, and then, out of nowhere, the tree around us lit up with tiny green lights. At first I thought they were fireflies, but they were too bright, too steady. The lights glowed from within the trees, as if they were embedded in the wood itself. "What the hell?" Dylan whispered, his eyes wide. I took a step closer to one of the trees, shining my flashlight on the trunk. The lights were coming from inside the scratches, the same deep marks I'd noticed earlier. And as I watched, the lights began to pulse in time with the humming sound, growing brighter and more intense. Suddenly there was a loud crack, like wood splitting, and one of the trees behind us groaned and shook violently. I turned just in time to see the ground near the base of the tree begin to bulge upward, like something was pushing its way to the surface. "Get back!" I shouted, grabbing Dylan and pulling him away from the spot. The ground erupted, sending dirt and rocks flying into the air, and from the hole something crawled out. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, some kind of insect, but massive. Its body was covered in a hard, translucent shell, and its eyes glowed with the same green light that was emanating from the trees. The creature's legs, long and spindly, clicked together as it pulled itself free from the earth, moving with an unnatural speed and grace. Dylan screamed, stumbling backward, and the creature's head snapped in his direction, its glowing eyes locking onto him. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at the thing, hitting it square in the side. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, recoiling from the impact, and darted back into the hole it had come from, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't wait around. Grabbing what little we had, Dylan and I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not stopping until we reached the logging crew's trucks parked at the edge of the forest. The next day, we returned with backup, armed officers and experts from the Forest Service. We scoured the area, but the hole where the creature had emerged was gone, filled in as if it had never been there. The lights in the trees had disappeared and the strange humming sound had stopped. No one could explain the scratches on the trees or the pulsing lights we'd seen, and there was still no sign of the missing protesters. Officially, the case remains unsolved. The loggers were pulled from the area, the camp was abandoned, and the forest was left to its secrets. But I know what I saw. I know what's still out there, deep beneath the ground, waiting. Some things are better left buried. The hungry ones. It wasn't the type of place you'd expect to find anything worth worrying about. Just another diner off the highway, the kind that serves coffee that's too bitter and pie that tastes like it's been sitting out for days. The kind of place people stop at only because it's the last option for miles. That's why I didn't think much of it when I first heard about the disappearances. I'm Kevin Hayes, a deputy with the Flagstaff Police Department, and a couple of weeks ago, we started getting reports about people going missing along Highway 89. At first, it seemed like your typical runaway cases, drifters, out-of-towners passing through. But then locals started vanishing, and that's when things got weird. The missing people all had one thing in common. They were last seen at Grady's Diner, a hole in the wall just outside of town, surrounded by desert and nothing else. It was the kind of place you could easily forget existed. I decided to check it out. I figured it would be a routine visit, ask a few questions, and maybe get a lead on where these people went. But the moment I stepped through the door, something felt wrong. The diner was quiet, too quiet. A couple of customers sat in booths, hunched over their plates, eating in silence. The waitress behind the counter gave me a tired smile, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. I shook my head and flashed my badge. "Deputy Hayes, I'm here to ask a few questions about the missing people." Her smile faltered and she glanced nervously at the kitchen door. "You'll want to talk to Grady. Is he here?" She hesitated, then nodded. "In the back." The kitchen door swung open and a large man in his 50s stepped out, wiping his hands on a greasy towel. He had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life working behind a grill, heavyset, with sweat stains on his shirt and a tired expression on his face. "I'm Grady," he said, his voice gruff. "What's this about?" "People have been disappearing," I said, keeping my tone calm. "They were last seen here. Do you know anything about that?" Grady's face hardened. "I don't know nothing about no disappearances. People come and go all the time. Ain't nothing strange about that." I studied him for a moment. He was lying. I dealt with enough people in my time to know when someone was hiding something, and Grady was hiding a lot. "I'm going to need to take a look around," I said. Grady's eyes narrowed. "Ain't nothing here but burgers and fries, officer." "Mind if I take a look in the kitchen then?" He tensed, and for a second I thought he might refuse. But then he stepped aside, waving me toward the door. "Go ahead. Ain't got nothing to hide." I pushed through the kitchen door and immediately regretted it. The smell hit me first, something rotten like spoiled meat left out in the sun. I looked around the cramped kitchen, taking in the greasy counters and the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. But what really caught my attention was the walk-in freezer in the corner. The door was slightly ajar, a faint whiff of decay wafting from inside. I glanced at Grady, who was watching me from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to check the freezer," I said. He didn't respond. I pulled open the freezer door and the stench hit me full force. I gagged, stepping back as the cold air rushed out. But it wasn't the smell that made my blood run cold. It was what I saw inside. Hanging from the ceiling were slabs of meat. At first I thought they were just cuts of beef or pork, but as I stepped closer, I realized with horror that they weren't from any animal. They were human. Limbs, torsos, and heads, stripped of skin, blood drained, hanging like carcasses in a butcher shop. I stumbled back, my stomach lurching. I turned to Grady, who was now standing just inside the kitchen, his eyes dark, his expression calm. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Grady smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "People gotta eat, deputy." I reached for my radio, but Grady was faster. He lunged at me, his meaty hands grabbing for my throat. I dodged to the side, knocking over a stack of dishes as I backed away. The other customers, no, not customers, the other things in the diner began to stir, their eyes shifting toward me, their faces twisted in unnatural hunger. I ran for the door, crashing through it and stumbling outside into the desert night. My heart raced as I fumbled with my car keys, desperate to get away. Behind me, I could hear the door of the diner creak open, followed by the slow, steady footsteps of something that wasn't quite human. I slammed the car door shut and floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down the highway, the diner disappearing into the darkness behind me. I reported what I'd found, of course, but when I brought the sheriff and a team back to the diner the next day, it was clean. The freezer was empty, the kitchen spotless, and Grady was nowhere to be found. No one believed me. They said I must have imagined it, that maybe I'd been out in the desert too long. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. Something hungry. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales, or if they kept you awake, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Let me know in the comments which one left you the most rattled. And remember, the darkness is always closer than you think. Until next time, stay safe, stay scared, and whatever you do, don't look behind you.